It was a quiet afternoon in Grandpa's study, the air thick with the scent of old books and pipe smoke. The ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound, steady and calm. I sat there flipping through a dusty album while Grandpa dozed off in his chair, glasses resting on the bridge of his nose, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his walls. Later that evening, I passed by the slightly ajar door of my parents' bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Not at first, but what I heard made me stop cold in the hallway. "He won't even know it's gone," my mom whispered sharply. "We'll get in, get the documents, and move it all before morning," Dad replied. I felt my heart drop. They were talking about Grandpa, his estate, his savings, everything he had worked for. The tone in their voices wasn't concerned or loving. It was calculated. Cold. I backed away, trying not to make a sound, when suddenly a small hand tugged at my sleeve. It was my younger brother, eyes wide and scared. "They're taking it all tonight," he whispered. I heard them before. They're waiting for him to fall asleep. My breath caught in my throat. I looked back at Grandpa's study, the man who had raised us when our parents were too busy chasing their own lives. He was kind, quiet, and generous. He'd given us everything, and now the very people he trusted most were preparing to rob him while he slept. I didn't know the full plan. I didn't know how far they were willing to go. But I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't do something soon, everything Grandpa owned, everything he treasured, would be gone by sunrise. Something shifted in me that moment. I wasn't just a teenager anymore. I was the only one standing between Grandpa and the people who were supposed to protect him. I had to act, and fast. Grandpa didn't believe in banks. That's something he told me countless times, usually with a half smile and a quiet grunt, as if daring me to challenge him. "Banks come and go," he'd say, "but a man's hands, they build what lasts." I always thought it was just one of his old-timey sayings, like the other advice he gave while trimming his hedges or oiling the hinges on our creaky front door. But now, after overhearing my parents' plan, those words came back with a different weight. I started remembering the stories he'd tell me as a kid, how he built this house brick by brick after the war, how he hid valuables in clever places long before burglar alarms were a thing. Once, he even joked, "One day, you might sit on a fortune and not know it." Back then, I thought he meant figuratively. Now, I wasn't so sure. Years ago, Grandpa had trusted my father with everything: legal papers, finances, even part of his land. But something went wrong. I didn't know all the details, only fragments whispered during family arguments. What I did know was that their relationship had changed. Cold dinners, tense silences, smiles that never reached their eyes. Grandpa never spoke harshly about Dad. He never accused him. But sometimes, I'd catch him staring out the window a little longer than usual. Regret etched deep in his face. That made me wonder, if Grandpa didn't trust banks and didn't trust Dad anymore, then where did he keep his money? It couldn't be in a regular drawer. Not in a house like this, a house he built with secrets in the walls. I began searching, in ways that wouldn't raise suspicion. Under floorboards, inside old tool cabinets. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that it was important. Then it hit me. The study. The old bookshelf Grandpa never let anyone touch. The one bolted into the wall. I suddenly realized the fight wasn't about money. It was about what the money represented. Legacy. Trust. Memory. My parents weren't just stealing paper. They were preparing to erase a man's life's work while he was still alive. And I couldn't let that happen. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Not silent, but quiet in the way that tells you something's wrong. The clinking of silverware on ceramic plates felt louder than the conversation. Everyone smiled, but none of it reached their eyes. Mom had made her signature roast, the one she usually saved for holidays or celebrations. Dad poured the wine, carefully, almost ceremonially, and raised a glass like it was just another cozy family evening. "Here's to health and happiness," he said. Grandpa gave a half smile and lifted his glass, but I saw the tremble in his fingers. He wasn't relaxed. He wasn't present. His eyes kept darting to the hallway, as if expecting something, or someone. Mom laughed a little too loud at one of Dad's jokes. Dad kept watching Grandpa's reactions, as if calculating something behind his glasses. And me? I didn't say much. I just watched, observed, noticed things I never would have noticed before. There was a flicker of tension every time Dad looked at Mom, like they were rehearsing some secret dance, like they both knew the steps, and I wasn't supposed to be part of it. Then Grandpa turned to me. His smile softened. He reached across the table with a serving spoon and placed a generous helping of mashed yams on my plate, his own recipe, which he knew I loved. "Hey, boy," he said warmly. "Your favorite." I looked up at him, startled by the calm in his voice. Then he added, almost in passing, "You only really know people when they think you're not watching." The words landed with more weight than he probably intended, or maybe he meant them exactly that way. He didn't look at Mom or Dad when he said it. He looked directly at me. For a second, I wondered, did he know? Did he suspect what was coming? The rest of dinner played out like a strange play, each of us pretending to be something we weren't. But I felt it, the crack beneath the surface. The smiles were masks. The meal was a distraction. And the knives on the table, they weren't all for food. That night, I understood. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was the last calm before something broke. The house was still, the kind of stillness that only happens after midnight, when even the walls seem to sleep. But I was wide awake. Something had pulled me out of bed. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the quiet click of a drawer being opened downstairs. Either way, I slipped out of my room, my bare feet brushing against the cold floorboards, and listened. Soft voices floated up from the study, my grandfather's study. My heartbeat kicked into my throat. "I told you it'd be here," Mom whispered sharply. "Check the bottom drawer again." "Already did," Dad hissed back. "Just get it and go. He's old. He won't even notice." I crept halfway down the staircase, staying in the shadows. From my angle, I could just make out Dad's back, hunched over the cabinet, yanking drawers open. A small metal box was already on the table beside him, dusty but clearly important. My stomach turned. That was Grandpa's emergency box. I'd only seen it once, years ago, when he was organizing things after Grandma passed. Wills, land papers, bonds, maybe even cash. I heard Dad curse under his breath. "Where's the backup key? You said you knew where he kept it." "I thought I did," he growled. They hadn't found it yet. Not the real key, but their frustration meant it was only a matter of time. Mom crossed the room and began searching the bookshelf, knocking on wood panels like she was listening for hollow sounds. She was systematic, careful, like she had done this before, maybe more than once. I backed up the stairs silently, my pulse in my ears. They were here, now, and they were serious. It was no longer a suspicion or a theory. It was happening. They were stealing from Grandpa while he slept down the hall. They were treating his life's work like a prize, a treasure chest left unguarded. But they were wrong about one thing. He wasn't alone, and I wasn't going to let them win. I hurried back to my room, mind racing. If they hadn't found the key yet, I still had a chance to act. But I had to be faster than them, and smarter. Because tonight wasn't just a betrayal. It was a countdown. The morning after the failed heist, I found Grandpa sitting outside on the porch, wrapped in his thick old cardigan, sipping tea like it was any other peaceful morning. But his eyes, they weren't sleepy or unaware. They were focused, watching the wind move the leaves. Listening, I sat beside him, unsure how to begin. The words tangled in my throat. After a long pause, I asked softly, "Have people ever disappointed you?" He didn't look at me right away, just took another slow sip, his hand steady despite the years. Then, without turning his head, he said, "You live long enough, and that becomes a certainty. But disappointment," he paused, "that's only painful when it comes from the people you raised to do better." I looked down at my hands. I could feel his words digging under my skin, not just because of what they meant, but because of what he might already know. I whispered, "And what do you do when you know someone's going to disappoint you, before they even do?" That's when he turned his head toward me, calm, unreadable. "I already gave someone I trust the means to protect what matters," he said. He didn't name names. He didn't point fingers. But something in the way he looked at me made everything click. The quiet moments in the garage. The day he asked me to hold onto an old envelope just in case. The half smiles when Mom and Dad weren't looking. He knew, all along. And more than that, he had chosen me. The real key. The real papers. The real protection. It wasn't some lock and code. It was trust, placed in my hands. That moment changed everything. Not because I was suddenly important, but because now I was responsible. For Grandpa. For what he built. For what he believed in. And for what they were trying to take. That evening felt painfully normal. Too normal. Mom was making popcorn in the kitchen. Dad queued up a movie none of us had asked for. The living room glowed with warm lamplight, soft music humming in the background. But beneath it all, I felt the weight of a secret plan. Mine. While they acted like a family enjoying a quiet evening together, I moved silently through the shadows of the house. I slipped into Grandpa's study, my fingers trembling as I reached into the back of the lower bookshelf, the one that didn't sit flush against the wall. Just as Grandpa had shown me once, I pressed the small wooden nut and heard the faint click. Behind the false panel was the old safe. Not flashy, not high-tech, but sturdy, trusted. I took out the key. His key, the one he had given me disguised in an envelope marked old tax files. I slid it in slowly, careful not to make a sound. The lock turned with a quiet clunk. Inside were the things that mattered most. Not just money, but meaning. Stacks of carefully wrapped cash. Legal documents. Titles. A sealed letter. Even Grandpa's Army service medal. His whole life story, protected behind steel. I didn't take everything. Just what mattered most. What Mom and Dad would want if they ever broke in again. I placed them gently in my backpack, wrapped in a clean towel, then replaced them with a decoy envelope filled with blank printer paper and expired utility bills. The safe clicked shut again. The bookshelf slid back into place. Back in the living room, they were laughing, pretending nothing had happened the night before. Dad was sipping wine. Mom was tapping on her phone. Neither noticed when I slipped outside during a bathroom break. I ran down the street under cover of dusk, my breath fogging in the cool night air. Every step was louder than it should have been. Every shadow felt like a threat. I wasn't just hiding papers, I was hiding the truth. I reached my best friend's garage, a place no one in my family ever visited, and stashed the bag in a locked cabinet under the workbench. It was done. I had just gone against my own parents, but not for revenge. For protection. For loyalty. For the only man who ever taught me what trust really means. The quiet didn't last long. I had barely returned to my room and pulled the covers over me when the first sound echoed down the hall, a sharp metallic clank. Then another. A drawer slammed shut. Footsteps thudded against the hardwood floor. They were doing it. Again, I slipped out of bed, moving just enough to hear without being seen. From the study, voices rose, louder, sharper. This isn't it. Dad snapped. Where's the rest? The envelope, the papers, everything's missing. I checked this whole box 3 times, Mom hissed. It's just junk. Where's the key? Did he move it? I could picture them, crouched in front of the safe, yanking out the decoy envelope filled with useless scraps, expecting thousands of dollars in estate documents, and finding nothing but disappointment. Footsteps stomped toward Grandpa's bedroom. Dad! My father's voice cracked through the silence. Did you move the files? Did you take the money? There was a pause. Then Grandpa's voice, low, steady. I haven't touched it. Another pause. A longer one. You're lying, Mom said, her voice clipped and flat. I'm old, Grandpa said, not foolish. And I know what I left where. I stayed hidden in the hallway, heart racing, palms slick with sweat. I could have said something, revealed the truth. But I didn't. I stayed silent. Because silence, in that moment, was the only thing that protected him, and what I'd done. Let them shout. Let them search. They weren't going to find what they wanted. Not anymore. The next morning, I entered the kitchen like nothing had happened. Dad was sitting at the table, nursing a bitter cup of coffee. Mom stood at the sink, rinsing dishes with more force than necessary. The tension from the night before hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Silent, but heavy. I poured myself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter. So, I I said casually. Was it a rough night? Dad's head jerked up slightly. Mom froze, then went back to scrubbing. What's that supposed to mean? Dad asked. I shrugged. Just. I thought I heard something. You know, drawers opening. Voices. Late. Must have been dreaming, though. Mom glanced at him, just for a second. It was quick, but I caught it. A spark of uncertainty. Of blame. Probably nothing, I continued. Although, if someone else heard it too, that might be awkward. Dad's jaw clenched. You're imagining things. Maybe, I said, letting the silence stretch a little longer. But dreams are funny. Sometimes they feel real. Like hearing someone say, just grab it and go. Stuff like that. Mom dropped a spoon. She recovered quickly, but the tension fled. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, she said, voice tight, but you better stop. I'm not playing anything, I replied with a polite smile. Just thinking out loud. I mean, if someone saw what happened, or recorded it, it could get messy, right? Dad stood up fast, knocking his chair back slightly. Enough. I met his eyes and didn't blink. Sure, just curious. I left the room with my juice, leaving behind a flicker of suspicion I knew would grow like a crack in glass. Because that's the thing about guilt, it doesn't need proof to do damage. It just needs doubt. The lawyer's office was nothing like I expected. No fancy leather chairs or crystal decanters. Just a small room stacked with files, law books, and the scent of old wood and paper. It felt timeless, like the kind of place where real decisions were made without flash, just facts. Mr. Ease, Grandpa's lawyer, looked up from his desk as I stepped in. He was older than I remembered, with deep-set eyes and silver hair slicked back like someone who didn't let time push him around. You're Joseph's grandson, he said, standing up to shake my hand. He hasn't sent anyone here in years. What's going on? I reached into my backpack and carefully placed the bundle on his desk. Cash, legal documents, the title to Grandpa's land, and a handwritten letter Grandpa had once told me to keep just in case. Then I spoke. I told him everything, from the night I overheard my parents' plan, to the fake key, to the decoy envelope. I told him how Grandpa had quietly given me the real key months ago and how I'd hidden everything in a safe place. Mr. Ease didn't interrupt. He just listened, brow furrowed, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. Well, he said, tapping the desk lightly, Joseph always had a sharp instinct. I see he passed that down. He opened a file drawer and pulled out the original will. Your father is the primary heir, as of now. But if Joseph wants to make a change, I can prepare everything. Quietly. What if he doesn't get the chance? I asked. What if they try to stop him? He nodded. Then we do it today. You brought proof. I'll make sure it holds. By the time I left, everything had changed. The will was being rewritten. Grandpa's estate, everything he owned, would now be passed on with protection and intention, not stolen in silence. By nightfall, my parents were still pacing the house, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. What they didn't know was they'd already lost. And it wasn't just about the money. It was about being locked out of a legacy they never deserved. A week passed like a strange, quiet dream. No alarms, no confrontations, just a tense, uneasy silence that blanketed the house like fog. Mom and Dad stopped speaking directly to Grandpa. Instead, they exchanged whispers behind closed doors, their voices tight and frustrated. I overheard bits and pieces. Maybe he moved it and forgot. No, he's not that senile. Then where is it? Don't look at me. You said you saw the box. They were unraveling, slowly, not in flames, but in cracks, the kind that spread invisibly until everything falls apart. Their plan had failed, and they didn't know why. That uncertainty gnawed at them more than any confrontation could have. They waited for Grandpa to cave, to forget, to confess. But he didn't. Instead, Grandpa became more peaceful. He spent mornings in the garden, humming old songs under his breath. He taught me how to repot basil. We played quiet games of chess on the porch, and sometimes he'd lean back in his chair and smile at the sky. Storms brewing, he said one evening, though the sky was perfectly clear. "You mean the weather?" I asked. He chuckled. "Not outside. In here." He tapped his chest. Then, with a glance toward the house, he added, "But storms pass. That's the thing. The good ones know when to wait them out." I looked at him, really looked, and I realized he wasn't unaware. He wasn't confused. He was patient. Grandpa wasn't waiting for them to change. He was watching them crumble. And while my parents quietly panicked, confused about how their plan had gone wrong, I spent my afternoons next to the man they'd underestimated. Not because he was old, but because he was wise enough to protect what mattered, and calm enough to know he'd already won. The silence in the house wasn't peace. It was the space right before the storm hits back. Sunday brunch at Grandpa's house had always been a tradition. Waffles, laughter, too many people squeezed around a too small table. But this one was different. Something in the air felt sharp, tense, like the house itself knew what was coming. Mom wore her brightest smile, too bright for someone who hadn't spoken to Grandpa all week. Dad hovered near the coffee pot, pretending to scroll through his phone, but I saw how his eyes kept flicking toward the study door. Grandpa, meanwhile, was calm as ever. He carved slices of pineapple with practiced ease, humming a tune I didn't recognize. Every now and then, he glanced at the front window like he was expecting someone. And then, a knock. All heads turned. Mr. Ease, Grandpa's lawyer, stepped inside holding a leather briefcase and a manila folder tucked under his arm. No one had seen him in years. "Good morning, folks," he said, polite but firm. Mom's smile faltered. Dad straightened. I felt my pulse pick up. Grandpa gestured toward the dining table. "Let's sit," he said. "There's something I want to share before we eat." We all gathered around, plates untouched. Mr. Ease opened his folder and cleared his throat. "As per Joseph's request, I'd like to read the amended provisions of his estate." Dad immediately leaned forward. "Wait, what amendment?" The lawyer didn't stop. He began reading, clearly, methodically, outlining each line. Property, assets, accounts. Every item that once fell under Grandpa's children now had a new designation. "To be passed in full," Mr. E said, glancing at me, "to the named legal heir, his grandson." The room dropped into silence. Mom's face turned pale. Dad's mouth opened, but no words came. Grandpa looked at me, warm, proud, steady. "I built this house with my hands," he said quietly, "and I watched what happened when those hands trusted the wrong people. But this one," he nodded to me, "never once let me fall." The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was spoken, signed, and sealed, with witnesses. They thought he'd grow weak with age. They never expected he'd grow sharp with memory, and that justice would be served over brunch. They waited until everyone had left, cousins, aunts, even the neighbors who had awkwardly clapped after the will was read. The house was quiet again, but the air wasn't calm. Mom cornered me first. Her eyes, once full of forced warmth, now burned with disbelief. "You tricked us," she snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "You manipulated him." Dad followed close behind, his tone lower, more dangerous. "You made us look like thieves in front of the whole family." I didn't flinch. Not anymore. "I didn't make you look like anything," I said calmly. "You did that all on your own." Mom stepped forward. His old, his confused. "No," I cut in. "His clear. His sharper than either of you gave him credit for. And I didn't trick him. I protected him. From you." That stopped them cold. For a second, the silence between us felt like a canyon. Grandpa appeared in the hallway then, leaning on his cane but standing tall. He'd heard it. All of it. "I chose right," he said, voice firm despite his age. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. I saw who came to me with love and who came with empty hands." Dad's shoulders stiffened. Mom opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Because what could they say? They'd been caught. Not in the act of theft, but in the deeper betrayal, of trust, of legacy, of blood. I stepped past them, slow and steady, my heart finally light. Not because I'd won, but because I had done the right thing, even when it meant standing alone. As I reached the doorway, I turned back once more. You thought I was just a kid, I said quietly. But I was the only one paying attention. And then I walked out, leaving behind two parents who could no longer hide from their reflection, not in each other's eyes and not in mine. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't anger. It's truth, calmly delivered by the one they thought was too young to matter. It happened on a quiet autumn morning. The kind of morning Grandpa would have loved. Soft sunlight streaming through the windows, the wind rustling the leaves just enough to make the world feel alive. He passed in his sleep, in his favorite armchair by the fireplace, a half-read novel resting gently on his lap. There was no drama, no final gasp, just peace. He left behind more than a will, more than land or accounts, old medals. He left behind something far more personal, a sealed envelope with my name on it, tucked inside his nightstand drawer. My hands trembled as I opened it. His handwriting was still neat, firm, familiar, to the only one who never looked away. I've had many years, many lessons, and many regrets. But the day I handed you that key, I knew one thing for sure. I had not failed completely. You didn't just save my money. You saved my faith in this family. That matters more. You were never just a kid. You were the echo of every good decision I ever made. And when I saw you stand up, quietly, bravely, I saw myself again. Not the man I was, but the man I had hoped to raise. One day, you'll grow old too. And when that day comes, you'll understand something I learned too late. The people who protect you in silence are the ones worth protecting forever. Thank you for being the reason I believed again. Love, Grandpa. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it back into the envelope. It wasn't about the house, or the documents, or even the will. It was about something deeper. Redemption, legacy, and trust, passed down not through blood, but through choice. Grandpa may have been the one who died, but I felt like he had just handed me a second life. And I vowed to live it the way he did, with quiet strength, fierce loyalty, and the wisdom to know that some battles are won, not by fighting, but by standing still, and remembering who stood by you when no one else did.